Namaha. Om Saraswati Namaha. Hari Om. And a very warm welcome to a very cold Cape Town. Today we're having our 8th sharing in the series of talks on Swami Venkatesananda, experience and lessons by the various disciples of Sri Swami Venkatesananda Ji Maharaj. So we feel very blessed to have another sharing. And this morning we are going all the way over to Australia, where we're going to have Swami Shobha Mataji. She's going to do the sharing today with us. So we feel very blessed that she can be able to share with us. I believe she lives in Denmark. That is a little town in Australia, not the country. But she's today at the Shivananda Ashram in Perth or Fremantle, which, as we know, was initiated by Sri Swami Venkatesananda Maharaj. And I believe she's also talking from Swamiji's room. So double and triple blessing to have that today. So with that, I warmly welcome everybody, and a very special welcome to Swami Shobha Mataji. And thank you so much for being able to share today. So I will hand over to you. Hari Om.
Swami Venkatesananda.
Yes.
Thank you so very much for this wonderful invitation. It is such a thrill what you've put together, and to be able to talk of Swami Venkatesananda, experiences and life lessons. What a joy on a Sunday afternoon in this 100th year. My goodness. Because Swamiji might say that it really wasn't your idea, it just dropped into you. But you were receptive to it and you've made it happen. And so I thank you most sincerely. As you say, I am sitting in the Shivananda Ashram Beacon Yoga Center in Fremantle, the ashram that Swamiji founded in 1976, and where he would come for 6 successive years for 3 intensive, brilliant months of each year. Our ashram, as you know, I'm sitting in his room, and this is a really wonderful thing, because just 2 years ago, the board suddenly said at our ashram that it was time to refurbish well and truly Swamiji's room. It's been always very quiet and very spacious, but recently we decided, that it was time to refurbish it. So it was repainted, and then it seemed to be many months before we got a carpet in, and everything seemed to go very slowly. And yet, it had a sense that something was actually happening, just like Swami Venkatesananda, rather spacious and vast. And we put down the carpet, and then again it was another 6 months, or no, it's not 6 months, but some months. And the room was very white. We painted it very white. It has a sense of being very vast and open, just like our teacher. And the carpet just added, in this very soft pale grey, still added to that vastness and spaciousness. And we didn't quite know where we were going to go from there. We really wanted this room to look like the master at this time. What we wanted, Swami Venkatesananda 2021 in this ashram now. Anyway, after some months, what happened was that we put a photograph finally of him, possibly my favourite photograph of him. It's the one where he sits. It's on the front cover of the Yoga Vasishta talks. And he sits, and his eyes are very, very, just a facial shot, and his eyes are very strong and very clear, and the rest of him starts sort of almost fading into spaciousness. And somehow you're held by the eyes, but at the same time, there's that great invitation to open and become spacier and more aware and conscious. And that was where it sat again for a number of months. And then we remembered that we really wanted to have some photographs just somewhere, just a little bit, because we wanted this room to be a quiet room, a room where you could come in and be still, and that would not impose on you, but would really allow you to find that quietness within, that quiet place within yourself, and to contact the actual spirit of this great master that we were lucky enough to have been in contact with. I don't know if you remember, but in Through the Corner of His Eyes, Swamiji talks about the Guru, and he said, the Guru is not just an incarnation, but a descent of God. Well, we wanted some photographs of the incarnation. And so we, as you can see, well, you can see them behind me. It only takes up about a quarter of a wall in this large room, but it takes you into the ashram in the 40s with Swami Venkatesananda and Swami Shivananda, and the extraordinary love that we experienced being around him whenever he spoke of his most beloved Gurudev. There's a sort of posed shot, and then there's a very candid shot of them outside the ashram in the late 40s, just talking together. And then down at my left, as you can see, there's a photograph of Swamiji close up as he's doing Pada Puja to his Guru's feet. And this room is open to everyone. That was what was really has not happened before. After we made it into this room, it really showed itself to be a place of stillness and quietness, and that it needed to be open to everyone who actually sought the silence, who sought a quiet place. You see, our ashram in 2021 is enormously busy. We have a great many things happening in all of the rooms and spaces and in our hall. And that the Master's room is now this place where you simply can come and be with yourself, very height of the experience, what he brought us back to in each of us. This room, strangely enough, it took so long for it to finally, us to see that this is what it would be. It seems so simple. But anyway, it was not so simple. The most intelligent things appear simple after they finally, got there. Girls, you've got to stop doing that. You've got to concentrate on me. I'm sorry. Okay. So, this is where we are in 2021 at this ashram, and I want to go back to the people and the situations that allowed me, us, to be sitting here in this most amazing place, those who made it possible. You see, it all started really for us in 1961, when the University of Western Australia invited Swami Shivananda to come and give a series of talks on yoga. Swami Shivananda said, well, he didn't travel, but he'd send someone in his stead, Swami Venkatesananda. And he said of him, he said, he is the crest jewel of my mission, the resplendence of my work. Will I see one who shines the brighter? Surely none have I ever seen. And Swami Venkatesananda came to Perth. You see, there was a great disciple of Swami Shivananda on the staff of our university. His name was Dr. Werter, and he was a lecturer in music for decades at the university. And in the late 40s, early 50s, he'd come across some of Shivananda's writings. Because as you know, Gurudev would just send out from the late 30s right through lots of his writings. He'd send them on pamphlets and tiny booklets, and he sent them everywhere. He didn't even have addresses for half. I don't even know where he sent them. You know this story. But lots of Europeans got to know of his writings, and Dr. Werter came across them in Western Australia in the late 40s, early 50s, and he was very fertile ground. When he read these teachings, he was so inspired and ignited, and he wrote to the master, and Swami Shivananda wrote back. You know, Swami Venkatesananda tells us in Through the Corner of His Eyes, he said that when he was a 14-year-old schoolboy, he wrote to Swami Shivananda, and Swami Shivananda wrote back. He said, this was most unusual. Very few holy men or women did write back. But we all know that Gurudev was a prodigious correspondent. Anyway, Dr. Werter and he continued a correspondence for some years. And then in the mid-50s, Dr. Werter got on a boat and went to India and met his master. And Swami Shivananda told him, as he did everyone, you must go back and conduct a regular satsang and no doubt repeat the mantra. And then he would have given him other things for his particular temperament, the particular pathway of yoga that he was most suited to. But Dr. Werter came back to Perth, and from 1955 until the late 80s when he passed, every Friday night he conducted a Shivananda satsang in his drawing room in a suburb of Perth. You know, hundreds, thousands of people were put in touch with Shivananda, Eastern philosophy, scriptures, in that drawing room. It went right up to the late 80s. I came across it in the 70s, and the alternative fringe then were turning up each Friday night on quite a regular basis. Anyway, he hosted Swami Venkatesananda to Perth in 1961. And you know, when the university put out about the adult education program for Swami Venkatesananda, hundreds of people booked in. I have to tell you, I'm really amazed at that. Perth was a sleepy little city. I mean, it still probably is, but in 1961, you know, it was a sleepy little city. And it was very isolated. And I love to have those thinking of people in their cars, turning up and after work to hear a young Swami fresh from the foothills of the Himalayas and the banks of the Ganges talk on yoga. In the 70s, Vera McArdle said to me, she said, you have no idea how thrilling that was. She was at those first talks. She said, they were hanging off the rafters. You could have heard a pin drop. Yes. And Walter Dawson, he talked of those talks. He wrote to Swami Shivananda at the end of them, and he said this. He said, the Perth Self-Realization Fellowship Group send you joyful acknowledgement of your supreme gift to Western Australia in making it possible for Swami Venkatesananda to spend 2 divine weeks in the city of Perth. His public tour has been a tremendous success, culminating at the University of Western Australia, when the physics theatre was packed to the highest tier to hear his discourses on yoga and Christianity. He held and won the hearts of everyone present with his clear and lucid explanation of this difficult subject. Also, his very wonderful sense of humour, which had the audience rocking with laughter. Every question was answered with meticulous care. The tour has placed yoga on a much higher level in the eyes of the public and has done a tremendous good for the World Brotherhood cause. In the audience that night were Fred and Vera McArdle. They had opened the first yoga school of Perth in the centre of the city in 1957. And it would be, for the next few decades, the primary seeding ground for yoga teachers in Western Australia. Fred and Vera were real internationals, and so, it was very much the philosophy of yoga that was added to their teaching program. And on that night, they brought with them a group of their young trainee teachers. And 3 of those people's life from that night on was completely changed. A direction was inexorably set. 2 of them were a young married couple called John and Nancy Horwood, and the other Lionel Drummond. Nancy would become Lakshmi, and many of you will know of Lakshmi. She is, yes, anyway, I'll go further into that a bit later. But she told me that from the moment she saw him come onto the stage, she knew that this was her life. That's how she put it. This was life. This is what she'd been waiting for. She didn't know she'd been waiting for anything until she saw it. So the 3 of them, after that night, they kept in contact with Swami Venkatesananda. And very shortly after, they started a branch of the Integral Yoga Association under his direction. And in those very early years, in the 60s, very early, Swami Venkatesananda invited Nancy to travel with him and a small group of people around India. And she did. She would get her name, she would get her name Lakshmi at that time on this very early trip. And I can't imagine what it must have been like for her. She was a country girl. She was, Perth was really a city for her. She came from Geraldton, and she'd only been, I think, a few years in Perth. And she suddenly, within this time, the next thing she knew, about a week or so into her time in India, she was on Delhi railway station. And she told me a story which I wanted to share with you. She said they were on Delhi railway station and she had become distracted for a moment and found herself separated from the group. At that moment, a beggar woman approached her with a babe in arms, indicating that she was hungry and the babe was hungry. She was thrusting the baby towards her. Lakshmi, highly agitated, fumbled in her purse and pushed a rupee note at the woman. Newly arrived in India, she was unfamiliar with the currency and had inadvertently given a large note because within seconds she was surrounded by a crowd of beggars, all closing in on her, thrusting their outstretched hands in her face, chanting, "Bakshi, Bakshi, Bakshi." She was terrified. Frantically pulling money from her purse, she began throwing it at them, and they just kept pushing in and coming in on her. At that moment, Swami, having noticed that she was missing, made his way through the small crowd who parted for him, and he stood beside her. He took out his purse and, acknowledging each person with his gaze, placed a coin gently into each hand. The group quietened and soon dispersed. He then turned to Lakshmi and said, "Lakshmi, you are not obliged to give, but if you do give, give with love." I felt so small, she recalled, all those years later. I just wanted to shrivel up and disappear. And when she told me that story decades later, she visibly became smaller. Anyway, from that time, from 1961, Swamiji came to Perth every 3 years, more or less. And when he did, he always gave a series of talks for our university, apparently. And he was invited by the Theosophical Society each time to give a lecture. He would have gone to Doctor's Verta Place and given a satsang. All the times from 1964 on, he was hosted by Lakshmi and her husband John, and he stayed with them in their home. And Lionel and the other two were all teaching yoga very much by 1964. They had an enormous number of classes. And, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. Lakshmi mainly did, and Lionel. John, of course, was earning a living, and at the same time, you know, outside his working time, he was teaching. But they were doing all sorts of things for the IYA. They were already had a little magazine up by 1964 that went on and, well, just kept going on, actually. But Lionel and Lakshmi, it was a long time between drinks. Only every 3 years did he come, you know. And they really wanted an ashram. They felt that if there was an ashram or a centre, a place of his own, he'd come more often. Well, you know, there was no money. We're talking now, we're up to about 1970. He'd be coming back every 3 years or so. And they found this place in John Street, Fremantle, which was really derelict. It was still had all the bare bones of a beautiful place, a beautiful house, but it had been vandalised, and all over the walls were, graffiti, and there was broken glass everywhere, and apparently open cables for electricity. And they were able to get it, therefore, for a peppercorn rent. And determined, they got in and started cleaning it up and started advertising for people that they wanted to start this ashram, and would people come along and help. And started very small, but soon it really built. And, you know, they had quite a strong little following who would come and support the yoga days and come every Friday night to satsang. And in that time, I'm sure Swami Venkatesananda was very much involved. And they restored it to a degree that they had a caretaker downstairs, and they had an ashram. And I presume Swamiji came in 72. He may have even come again in 73. I don't know. I remember 1974 because that was the year that I met him. I'd been living in Sydney. I had a career, and then, as sometimes happens, everything goes. I had a very strong experience, and everything started twirling around and completely changed. And I left my career and sort of came home to Perth in a rather bewildered state, and moved back in with my parents at 27. And got a bit of work, but I really didn't know where I was going because everything had changed so much about what I thought was going on in this life. Not that I really knew what was, but certainly things had shifted. And I was one of those extremely lucky ones, and I'm sure some who are listening now would have had this experience. You know, I was somehow, you know, walking around somewhere in Perth, and I came across this little bookshop, and it was the Theosophical Society bookshop. I'd never heard of it, never heard of Theosophy. And I went up the stairs of these steps, and there's this little bookshop, and it was like just the most amazing place that answered or called to everything that seemed to be all its sixes and sevens within me. There were all these photographs and books from strange and amazing people from all over the world. It was like, I felt like I was in a Herman Hesse novel, actually. I was quite fond of Hesse at the time, and it seemed that magical. And this old woman could see that I was, well, she wasn't that old. She was probably younger than me at the time, but, you know, when you're 27, people look pretty old. And she knew I'd been really struck, so she said, come and have a look at our library. Well, if I thought the bookshop was something, the library. It wasn't so big, but it was so deep and vast, you know, that I really, yeah, it felt like things were going to be sort of okay. I joined the TS, and a few months later, you know, I joined a community, and we ran a vegetarian restaurant in one of the suburbs of Perth. It was probably the first vegetarian restaurant, and a whole food store. And one day this woman came into the store. She was holding a poster, and she said, could we put the poster up on the wall? She had a very strong gaze. I thought she was very strong, but actually she introduced herself, and she said, I'm Lakshmi Horwood. And I realized, of course, when I got to know Lakshmi, that she was the most focused person I ever did see. And it was just actually how she was. She was so focused. Anyway, all around the walls of the whole food store were posters of all sorts of teachers and luminaries. 74 was an amazing year for Perth. So many people passed through, philosophers and teachers of different persuasions. So I said to her when she wanted to put this poster up, oh, not another one. And she said to me, this one's different. And I said, that's what they all say. It's a funny thing. I would say that I completely forgot about Lakshmi and that conversation. But here we are talking about it now. Somehow or other, important things that happen to us, even if we don't register them at the time, they come back to us. Anyway, the next thing, I'd forgotten about the Swami, and sort of months later, or a month or so later, some friends rocked up outside the house we were all living in, and one of my friends jumped off the back of the ute. We used to travel in backs of utes then, you know, 6 or 8 of us. It would be illegal now. And he ran up to the front and he said, you've got to come with us. You've got to come with us. You've got to meet this guy, this yogi, this holy man. He said, he's a bonfire. Sit over there. Sit over there. Both need to sit up. Thank you. He's a bonfire. And that was, where was I? Sorry. So anyway, we get into the back of the ute and we travel to North Fremantle, and it stops in front of the ashram, and we bundle up, making lots and lots of noise and chatting to each other, and we threw open the doors of this room, and it was packed with people and completely silent. And some of our friends looked round and sheepishly, you know, sort of smiled at us. It was very still and quiet in there, and at the centre of it, there was this, how did I see it? I saw this shaven head, very still, golden skinned, flaming orange, dressed in flaming orange, sitting completely still and quiet, so still and so quiet that it was tangible. I remember that. I'd never thought of stillness or silence actually having substance, but all around him, it was completely still, and nobody, not still, sorry, it was empty, even though the rest of the room was so packed. It was empty, and it was like nobody could have gone into that space. You really knew that it was occupied. Anyway, after some time, it seemed, he looked up and he said, if God exists, and then there was this very long pause, and then he said, if God exists, he's the quietest thing in the universe. You don't even understand one little emotion that comes up in your own heart. Shall we start from there? And we did. 74. Whew. That was one big year. I mean, my God, I got to know what it meant, that cliche that says an iron, like an iron filing to a magnet. We were just, not just me, a number of us, you know, like it didn't seem to matter what you were doing or where you were, you know, like all of a sudden there'd be this pull, oh my God, this is happening. And you had to get there. You had to be there. You know, all my friends at the restaurant and in the community, they knew that they had to help me in every way, that I just had to be at all these events at the program. And yes, and they would, you know, rearrange shifts, and sometimes I'd get a lift or let me get out early enough that I could hitch up the highway to get to his programs. Yeah, that was meeting Swami Venkatesananda. Lakshmi told me, she said, you know, she said, for years and years, I would be asking Swamiji, you know, when can we have an ashram, Swamiji? When can we have a place that we can live in, we can reside in, where we can live the yogic lifestyle from morning till night? You know, that we're not just dropping in on a satsang or dropping in on a class. We can do it all day, all night. All the pathways of integral yoga we can practice. And he said to her, oh, always kept saying to her, not yet, Lakshmi, not yet, sort of fobbing her off. And she said, but you know, I mightn't be much good at most things. Well, I think we all know Lakshmi was pretty amazing at just about everything to do with yoga. She lived at this ashram for decades. She led it for decades. But she was a tremendous yoga teacher, hatha yoga teacher. She had many, many classes, many, many students. And she could lecture on any of the pathways of yoga, run workshops. And of course, she was a wonderful editor of Swamiji's works. She compiled a lot of them. She was, you know, from the time she saw him, right up. Everything was for Venkatesha, and everything she did was to honour what it was that was her connection with this great being. You know, she had been sent, when she went that first year to India, Swamiji sent her to Iyengar. She was Iyengar's first Western student. And when she came back to Perth, she taught Iyengar yoga. And she went to Sydney to the International Yoga Teachers Association, and she taught them all, showed them Iyengar yoga. Within a couple of years, of course, so many from all over Europe and from Australia too, travelled to practice with and to study with Iyengar. Yes, anyway, what I wanted to tell you, she said, you know, I mightn't be much good at something, but I'm like a bulldog. She said, once I get my teeth into that trouser leg, I don't let it go till it's done. So she assured me. She kept harassing Swamiji over the years. Swamiji, when can we have an ashram? You know, when can we live yogic lifestyle? You know, not yet, Lakshmi, not yet. But in 1975, when she said that to him, he said, now, Lakshmi. She was up and running. I think she had so much faith, of course. She knew. She'd waited. All he had to say was, now, Lakshmi. And she knew what was going to happen. There was no money. I mean, you know, there was nothing. They were going to look for an ashram, a residential ashram to buy. But he said, now, Lakshmi. And she knew it could happen. And at that time, you know, as I said to you, she was an amazing yoga teacher. And she had healed a very wealthy Perth businessman's daughter, his daughter was a chronic asthmatic, young girl, chronic asthmatic, and he had taken her all around the world to doctors and physicians, etc., and they hadn't been able to help her. And, you know, in sort of desperation, somebody had mentioned yoga. Certainly wasn't a very popular course at that time in Western Australia in the 70s. And anyway, so he brought her to Lakshmi, and Lakshmi taught her yoga breathing and was able over a period for her to be completely healed. I need to say something. Yes, I know lots of wonderful teachers can teach you yoga breath, but the thing that I've realized so much in retrospect, being around Lakshmi, was when it came to yoga, she was a great healer. She had a great touch, a great insight, and a great generosity. Yes. So anyway, they found the ashram in 1976, very soon after. They tendered for this place. It had been a beautiful old home way back at the turn of the century. It's a very big place. It's in a sandstone. It's on half an acre. And underneath, I presume, were originally the servants' quarters with a number of very large rooms, or pretty large rooms, and smaller ones. And this is where ashramites would live. And then upstairs, there were a number of beautiful guest rooms, one of which that I'm sitting in. It was Swami Venkates's room. And so Lakshmi moved in with sort of 6 or 8 people at that time. And one of them, of course, was Swami Parvatiananda. And the rest were younger people who were wanting to live, very fired up to be yogis. So I didn't move in. I think Swami Venkatesananda in 1976 came twice to Perth. He came originally to found the ashram, and then he came later in the year for that first 3-month residential. I wasn't living at the ashram at that time, and I didn't intend ever to live at the ashram. Around Swami Venkatesananda, what you intended, well, sometimes, yeah, I didn't intend to live at the ashram. And it was about sort of 10 months into it when he came back. And I want to read you something that happened at that time, one of my anecdotes of that time. I say, it's 1976. I will always remember that night at the Theosophical Society. Whenever Swamiji came to Perth, the Theosophical Society invited him to speak. I was the secretary of the TS at the time, and having met Swamiji 2 years before, I was now attending all of his program. I remember how proud and excited I felt that night As I sat in the front row of the packed hall, Swami did not disappoint. He spoke on vichara, inquiry, and after an hour, invited questions. There was the usual pause at this point as people considered, and then a woman's voice called, "Swami." I took a quick glance behind to see who it was. She had stood up. Her face was tired and distressed, and her eyes fastened on Swami. And then she said, "Swami, I was the Queen of Sheba in my last life, and because of that I am suffering so much in this life. But I don't think it's fair, because everyone in Sheba's day was cruel. It was the times. So why must I suffer so?" I threw my face into my lap, appalled. I had been to enough discussions to know that you didn't ask questions like this without it getting shot back to you with a derisive snort and something like, "You don't even understand what's happening now, what's right in front of you, and you want to talk about past lives, chakras, dreams, nonsense." You learned pretty quickly not to go there, and we always froze when someone new came to discussion with such a question which was sure to get short shrift, but not always. The pause seemed interminable, but it was no doubt my embarrassment that extended it. I was mortified that this society, of which I was a secretary, had someone who would ask such a totally unrelated question, and such a silly one as well. And then he spoke. "Madam," the tenderness in his voice lifted my head up. He was sitting forward, looking at her like a brother, and his voice was tender. "Madam, indeed, the times were brutal, but Sheba took license." There was a pause as something heavy lifted. "Thank you," she said quietly, and she sat down. The next day, I was running a little late for afternoon discussion. I had to catch a couple of buses and I came after work, and those wonderful discussions that happened every weekday, Swamiji would always start with a bit of a chat, and then he would open up to questions. So when I arrived, he was sort of still having a little chat. He looked at me with those eyes, those bright eyes, sort of, then looked back again and finished the conversation. And then he said, "How did you enjoy last night?" I blurted out, "Oh, Swami, I nearly died. When that woman told you that she was the Queen of Sheba in her past birth, and that was why she was suffering in this one, I thought you would decimate her." He replied, "How could I? She was so sincere." I'd got it. Until that moment, I'd found it impossible to get any sort of handle on Venkatesh's behaviours or responses. They were impossible to track. As soon as you thought you had a line on him, something else would happen. For instance, his responses to questions in our discussion time. Occasionally someone, including me, would ask a really intelligent question and he'd brush it off with a yes, yes, or a snort and ignore it and take another question. And sometimes when someone would ask an airy-fairy, rambly, past life, dream, out of the body question, he'd take it and open it up into an informative and intelligent place. You just never knew. It seemed random. But the key to the response was sincerity, the questioner's sincerity. I asked a lot of questions and had felt offended on the occasions when I'd been given the brush off. From that time on, when it happened, retrospectively, I was aware of wanting to appear smart or wanting to draw his attention. And when it happened to others, I knew it had to be a case of insincerity with them too, even though often it was not apparent. You know, at our ashram now, on Monday mornings, our house manager and spiritual mentor for our residents, Chinmaya Saraswati, has a Monday morning meeting. And when I'm in town, sometimes, very often, she invites me to join and to talk with the ashramites and answer any questions if they have any. And this morning, which was not so long ago, it started. They, of course, were talking about the practical aspects. They knew I'd lived at the ashram for a very long time, as it turned out. And they sort of were asking me about that. And then someone said, what did Swami Venkatesananda ever say to you that, you know, you could say really helped you? I don't know where you'd begin there, but I came up with something. And the three things that I came up with are very linked together. And I thought those are the ones I'd share today. I said to them that he had said, you have only one friend and one enemy in this life. And that friend or enemy is your own mind. When your mind is calm and clear, it is your friend. And when it is disturbed and distracted, it is your enemy. That was the most wonderful teaching, you know, right up until then. You know, I'd tried to make people like me outside. Of course, I still do, you know, because I keep forgetting. I begin to think that avidya, which they say is ignorance, that you could actually say avidya is forgetfulness. You know, we forget the wisdom, we forget what we learn again and again. We need our friends who keep reminding us. And they say, you always say that. And I say, yeah, but I forgot. In the thrall of life, we forget. But this teaching showed me it has been so powerful that, you know, I only have to make one friend. You know, I only have to make one friend, and that's myself. So that when I get disturbed by people's reactions towards me or what I think they're thinking about me, etc., I know that already for me to be actually disturbed by this, that what is happening inside me is disturbed, and that this is a time to now withdraw, if I can, to hold on to myself, to practice some of those wonderful yoga practices. I know the yoga practices are for self-realization. You know, they take you all the way up to that doorway. But, you know, for me, the yoga practices mostly are trying to be a better person, trying to understand what's going on and to not cause too much trouble in this world. And just to remember whenever I'm disturbed by something, it's not coming from the person. God knows what's happening with them. I can't begin to know that, but I can begin to know what's happening with me. I need to go and take some care. I need to go and be with myself. That's a wonderful teaching. And it's a regular one I need to remember. And then it follows on from that, and I think this is almost, of course, everything I'm doing here is paraphrasing Swami Venkatesananda, and of course it's my Venkatesananda. The things that struck me about this vast teacher just a very few that have to do with who I am. But in the Bhagavad Gita, in his daily readings, he writes in one paragraph, he says, the outer circumstances have but a neutral intrinsic value. It is the inner state that determines them. Same thing, but very beautifully put. And then one last one. It was very shocking. And we remember, I found Swami Venkatesananda very shocking at times. He shocked me. I remember, again, it was in 76, and it was before I'd moved into the ashram, and we hadn't built our big yoga hall, which was going to hold, you know, a couple of hundred people. And so they had hired the South Fremantle High School. They not just the gym there, and of course the restaurant, etc., to have a 2-day seminar with Swamiji. And he had sorry. Okay, I'll stop. A 2-day seminar with Swami. And I had come along, and I never actually got to sort of sit with him. I didn't, it was for people probably, many people were, sorry, I'll just pause for a moment. This day, he was sitting with a few people having morning tea, and somehow or other I got to be at the table. And in the course of just talking, he said something that was so shocking to me, something, I can't remember what it was. It was something about the human condition or human nature. And it frightened me. And I said to him, Swamiji, you can't say things like that. If you say things like that, people will call you negative and destructive. And he looked at me with those age-old eyes. Sometimes they were like that. And they were somber, very serious. And he said to me, Susan, people who have told the truth throughout history have been called negative and destructive. That was a great teaching for me, to realize so often that when one's accused of negativity, it's often that effects being put forward that is not, people do not want to know. I'm going to actually cut now because I can see my time is really moving. I'm going to jump to 1982, because 1982 for all of us was a huge year. It was a very big year. Some of us, because we were around Venkatesananda in that last year, had no sense that he was about to leave the planet. Others of us who just picked it up in all sorts of different ways, and when we knew what a shift it was for all of us. And I just want to say that 82 here was extraordinary at this ashram from the time he came. You see, so many things happened that were, you can say in retrospect, so uncharacteristic. Swamiji allowed so many things that we'd never had that opportunity for before. So what happened, the first thing I'm just going to pluck out was that a man came to the ashram just after Swamiji had arrived, and he was from my past, from Sydney, and I'd known him to be a very fine cameraman and editor. And he was obviously going through some sort of a hard time. God knows how he ended up at Shivananda Ashram and with a friend, and he and I met up again. We hadn't seen each other for about 8 years. And he sat and listened to Swamiji. And at the end of it, at the end of the talk, he came up to me and he said, have you ever made a documentary of him? And I said, no. He said, I've got time. Why don't we make a documentary? You know, I thought, oh my God. And the hardest thing about that was I couldn't imagine Swamiji being in it. You know, Swamiji kept saying about everything, keep it small, better that way, you know. He wouldn't let us do any covered covers. We slipped one through and then they all got slipped through. But he didn't care. He just wanted the books out. No, the substance was what was important. Everything else could follow. Just do the work, you know. And the people who are really interested will come. Anyway, I thought, he's never going to go for a documentary and being filmed. He wouldn't just... So I sort of came up with some of my friends. We worked all the arguments that I were to put to him to make it possible for it to happen. And I went to his door and I can remember, he said, come in, you know. I came, I said, Swamiji, a friend of mine has come as a filmmaker and he's wanting to make making a documentary on your life and it's really important. And he said, okay. Oh, we got through the corner of his eyes. That then, he told us that that year, for those 14 lectures, he was going to be talking on the Yoga Vasishta. Now, you and I know that this was his most beloved scripture. He loved the Vasishta. He thought it was, you know, the pathway to realization. Remember, somewhere at the front of his book, he said, you know, if you want that, then you are welcome to the Yoga Vasishta. You are welcome to the Yoga Vasishta. He once told us, he said, you know, I didn't know if it was true, but the American Indians, apparently, when people died, they put them in canoes and they surrounded them with victuals and then pushed them out into the water, just in case when they woke up, they hadn't died and they could eat all of this food and they might get to be rescued. But he said, you know, he said, if you put me in a canoe, just drop in the Yoga Vasishta. And he said, if I wake up out there in the water, I'm just going to read and read and read it until I expire. Yeah. Anyway, we said, Swamiji, can we videotape it? Again, amazed. No, with all the arguments, can we, just this once, can we actually film it? We'd never filmed. All those years that he came and gave series of lectures, we never videoed. But that year, there was all this stuff hanging in the air, thank God. And he said yes. So, as you know, we have 14 extraordinary talks of the Vasishta. You could spend, I'm still only up to about number 8. I'm going to expire well before I get to the end of these talks. But just that they exist and all that enormous body of work, all that writing that exists, you don't have to have met the master. I know so many people who truly are with Venkatesananda because, and other teachers of course, because what they have brought to the readings has ignited them and they're in the presence of that. What a wonderful thing that they don't have to stay in the body, of course. We have their word. We have so much else that keeps us in contact with essentially what they are. And then the final thing was sannyas, I have to say. You know, that year, Lakshmi had taken sannyas in 81, Svayam sannyas, and that year, a number of others took sannyas in Rishikesh, and one of them was one of the young women that lived here. Her name was Janet, and she was with Swamiji that year, and she took sannyas, and she came back with him and with a group, with the wonderful Sushila Devi. They came back with Swamiji that year, and we were, you know, it was very surprising. It was very intense. It was very beautiful. And, you know, the year went on, and then my friend, you know, Janet came back, Janaki. There were 3 of us that were long-term ashramites here, and there were about 8 or 10 or 12 people who lived here for, you know, those 6 years already, and would live for many years after. And suddenly Joe, Swamiji was in Sydney at the time with the wonderful Jyoti Brunston, great disciple of Swamiji's. And when he was there, Joe just really strongly felt that she would take sannyas, and he sent back all the rituals and the chants and what we needed to do. And so Janaki and I went down to the ocean, and Joe undertook all the rituals. And that night, her name was given to her, and it was Hamsa. And it was many months later, well, not very many months, but it was later again that suddenly it struck me. And yes, I too took sannyas. And these three young women, well, I was 35 by that stage, not so young, but these other two, they were 25. So they were very young women. And so then that was August, more or less, July I took it. Swamiji left in August, and you know, a few months later, he passed. You know, I remember how it was. I keep seeing the three of us, these young, you know, in our orange robes, but we had something. He'd left us. Of course, he'd left it with much, but those orange robes gave us a certain authority for a while, in the ashram and the wider community, but better still, it gave us, when we would have been very likely, I speak for myself, maybe scattered, maybe left the ashram shortly after. I always said I would leave after he left. I didn't mean past, I just meant if he didn't come back here. But, you know, we were in sannyas. We'd made a commitment. And we would be in sannyas for about 3 years. And in that time, we lived incredibly deeply in the practices of yoga, in the study, in the commitment to this place, this ashram, that it would continue on. Of course, Swamiji gave us all the, you know, the satsangs and all the things that we did every day. They continued with or without him. So whether he was on the planet or not, they would continue. We had satsang every night, meditation every morning, full moon havans, and on and on. But the greatest thing was, I always find with this master, with this being, that everything that I saw happened, and in retrospect, 40 years even down the line, what he put in place was always so good for us. Everything was freeing. You never felt that there was any expectation from you, for you. He was enormous. He is enormous. And to have this room now in 2021 in his ashram, refurbished, and I feel really expressing what it is over all these decades that I've come to know that I was in the presence of, and I'm still in the presence of. This room that takes us, invites us into the vastness, invites everybody with no imposition, and asks us to come back to ourselves, gives us a place we can come to remind us to come back to ourselves. I am enormously grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Swami Shobha Mataji, for that wonderful and loving sharing of your Guru, Swami Venkatesananda ji. It was very moving. Thank you so much. We haven't got organized a new speaker yet for this coming month, September month, but we will keep you in touch with that. So God bless you all. Thank you so much. Hari Om. Om Asatoma Satgamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Mritam Gamaya. Om Shanti 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 Sakurvan Ki Jai.